I still remember the exact weight of the champagne glass in my hand. It was one of those fancy crystal flutes my mother had collected over decades, the ones we only brought out for weddings, christenings, and milestone birthdays. The glass felt impossibly fragile as I stood there in my father's living room, surrounded by 43 members of our extended family, watching my older sister Claire rise from her chair with that smile she had perfected over years of community theater and manipulation. My father was turning 67 that evening, and none of us knew that by the time the cake was cut, our family would be shattered into pieces that could never be reassembled the same way again. But I should go back to the beginning because you need to understand what our family was before you can truly appreciate what Claire destroyed. And more importantly, you need to understand how I eventually made sure she paid for every single lie she ever told. My mother passed away when I was 24 years old, breast cancer. She fought for 3 years with a dignity that still makes my chest ache when I think about it. My father, Thomas, was her high school sweetheart, and when she died, something in him dimmed, like someone had turned down the brightness on his soul. He didn't collapse or fall apart the way some people do. Instead, he became quieter, softer, and infinitely more devoted to his 3 daughters. We were all he had left, he would say. We were his whole world. Claire was the eldest, 4 years older than me. Growing up, she was everything I secretly wished I could be. She had our mother's beauty, this effortless grace that made everyone in a room notice her the moment she walked in. She did theater in high school and college, and for a while she moved to Los Angeles to pursue acting. That dream crumbled after 6 years of bit parts and rejection, and when she came back to our small town outside of Philadelphia, she brought with her a bitterness she learned to hide beneath that dazzling smile. Sophie was the youngest, 5 years my junior. She was always the sensitive one, the artist, the one who felt everything too deeply. Where Claire commanded attention, Sophie observed from the corners of rooms, sketching in her notebooks and noticing things the rest of us missed. I fell somewhere in the middle, both literally and figuratively. I was the practical one, the one who became an accountant, the one who organized family holidays and remembered everyone's anniversaries. I was the bridge between Claire's need for the spotlight and Sophie's quiet intensity. After Mom died, our roles became even more defined. Claire swooped in with grand gestures, organizing elaborate memorial services and posting lengthy tributes online. Sophie retreated into her art, processing her grief through colors and shapes that I could never fully interpret. And I handled the practicalities. I helped Dad with the life insurance paperwork. I cleaned out Mom's closet when he couldn't bear to do it himself. I made sure the bills were paid and the house was maintained while everyone else was allowed the luxury of falling apart. What none of us realized then was that Claire had already begun her deception. The seeds were planted in the months after Mom's funeral, watered by our grief and our desperate need to believe that at least our family would hold together. My father had done well for himself. He started as a contractor, built a small construction company from the ground up, and sold it for a comfortable sum when he turned 60. He wasn't wealthy by any extravagant standard, but he had the house paid off, a solid retirement fund, and savings that he planned to eventually split between his 3 daughters. He was generous to a fault, always slipping us money when he thought we needed it, always insisting on paying for family dinners. Claire was the one who convinced him to give her power of attorney. I didn't know this until much later. She presented it to him as a practical matter, something that would make things easier if his health ever declined. She was the eldest after all. She was married to a doctor. She understood these things. And our father, still raw from losing his wife, still operating in the fog of grief, signed the papers without mentioning it to Sophie or me. That was 7 years before the birthday party that changed everything. In those 7 years, I built a life I was proud of. I married Daniel, a software engineer I met at a friend's wedding. We bought a modest house 3 miles from my father's place. We talked about having children but decided to wait until we felt more financially secure. Daniel was steady and kind, the type of man who noticed when I was having a hard day and would draw me a bath without being asked. He loved my family, especially my father, and the two of them would spend Sunday afternoons watching football together while I helped Sophie with whatever creative crisis she was navigating. Claire's life looked perfect from the outside. She was married to Marcus, an anesthesiologist who worked long hours at the university hospital. They had a beautiful house in the nicest part of town, drove expensive cars, and took vacations to places I could only dream about. Claire had given up on acting but had reinvented herself as a lifestyle influencer, posting curated images of her seemingly flawless existence. She had 30,000 followers who believed every word she wrote. What those followers didn't know, what our entire family didn't know, was that Claire's life was a house of cards built on deception and our father's money. The first sign I missed came about 3 years before the birthday party. Dad mentioned casually that he'd helped Claire and Marcus with a down payment on their new house. I thought it was strange because Marcus was a doctor with a good salary, but I didn't question it. Claire was always Dad's favorite, even though he would never admit it. She had this way of making him feel needed, of making him believe that helping her was his idea. The second sign was more subtle. Sophie called me one night, worried because she'd asked Dad for a small loan to upgrade her computer equipment for her design business, and he'd seemed hesitant. Dad had never been hesitant about helping us before. When he eventually gave her the money, it was less than she'd asked for, and he'd made a comment about needing to be more careful with his spending. Sophie and I talked about it briefly, wondered if maybe his investments weren't doing as well as before, and then we let it go. The third sign was the one that finally made me pay attention, though even then I didn't understand its significance. It was about 18 months before that fateful birthday party, and I was visiting Dad on a Tuesday afternoon. He was in the kitchen making tea when the mail arrived. Among the usual letters was an envelope from his bank. He opened it, and I watched his face change. Just for a moment, there was something there, confusion, maybe fear. Then Claire called his cell phone, and he stepped into the other room to answer, leaving the bank statement on the counter. I glanced at it. I'm not proud of that, but something made me look. The balance in his savings account was significantly lower than I expected, significantly lower than it should have been based on what I knew about his retirement finances. There were several large withdrawals over the past few months, each one exactly $9,000, just under the threshold that would trigger automatic reporting to the IRS. When Dad came back into the kitchen, I asked him casually about his finances. He waved away my concern with a forced smile and said Claire was helping him with some investments. She knew a person who was getting great returns. He trusted her completely. That night I told Daniel about the bank statement. He looked troubled but reminded me that it wasn't really my business. Dad was a grown man, Claire was his daughter and his power of attorney. If there was something wrong, surely Dad would notice. Surely Claire would never actually hurt her own father. I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe it. So I pushed my suspicions to the back of my mind and went on with my life. For the next 18 months, I focused on my marriage, my career, and trying to get pregnant. That last part became its own source of heartache. Month after month of negative tests, of disappointment, of Claire's careless comments about how she'd decided not to have children because she valued her freedom too much. Daniel and I talked about fertility treatments, about adoption, about all the paths that might lead us to the family we wanted. It was exhausting and emotional, and it consumed most of my mental energy. During that time, Claire was busy too. She was busy draining our father's accounts with increasing boldness. She was busy spinning elaborate lies to explain where the money was going, and she was busy planning what she believed would be her ultimate escape from the consequences of her actions. I learned all of this later, piecing together the truth from bank records, emails, and the confession that would eventually spill out at that birthday party. But in the months leading up to that night, I was blissfully, stupidly unaware. The birthday party was Sophie's idea. She wanted to do something special for Dad, to gather the whole family and celebrate the fact that he was healthy, loved, and surrounded by people who cared about him. She planned it for weeks, sending invitations, coordinating dishes for a potluck, creating a slideshow of family photos that stretched back decades. Claire was supposed to help, but she was distracted and distant in the weeks leading up to the event. She'd show up to planning meetings late or not at all. She'd promise to handle the catering and then forget. Sophie vented to me about it constantly, but we both chalked it up to Claire being Claire. She'd always been self-absorbed. We'd learned to work around her. What we didn't know was that Claire was in a state of absolute panic. Her husband Marcus had finally discovered the truth about their finances. The beautiful house, the expensive cars, the lavish vacations. None of it was paid for with Marcus's salary. All of it, every last bit of it, had been funded by money Claire had stolen from our father. Marcus found out because he tried to refinance their mortgage and discovered that Claire had taken out a second loan against the house without his knowledge. When he confronted her, she broke down and confessed everything, not just the mortgage, but the credit cards in his name he didn't know about, the investment account she'd emptied, the hundreds of thousands of dollars she'd siphoned from our father over 7 years. Marcus was devastated. He was a good man, an honest man, a man who had built his career on trust and integrity, and he had been unknowingly complicit in a scheme that had robbed an elderly widower of his retirement security. The guilt was crushing him. He told Claire that she had to come clean, that she had to tell our father and find a way to make it right. Claire agreed. At least, she pretended to agree. In reality, she was making other plans. The night of the birthday party, I arrived at Dad's house early to help Sophie with the final setup. Dad was in good spirits, wearing the new sweater we'd gotten him, laughing at old photographs as we hung them around the living room. Relatives began arriving around 5 o'clock, aunts and uncles and cousins I only saw at events like this. The house filled with noise and warmth and the smell of home-cooked food. Claire arrived late, which was typical, but something was different about her that night. She was dressed more carefully than usual, in a sleek black dress that seemed wrong for a casual family party. Her makeup was flawless, but beneath it, I could see tension in her jaw, a tightness around her eyes. Marcus was with her, and he looked worse, pale, exhausted, like a man carrying a burden too heavy for his shoulders. I tried to catch Claire's eye, to ask if everything was okay, but she avoided me. She moved through the crowd with that performer's smile, accepting compliments and deflecting questions. She positioned herself near the fireplace, in the spot with the best lighting, the spot where everyone would be able to see her when she stood up to give her toast. The toast. That was the tradition. At major family events, we always went around the room and shared memories or well wishes. As the eldest, Claire always spoke first. She was good at it, or at least she had been. She could make people laugh and cry in the space of 3 minutes. She knew exactly what to say to make herself look loving and generous and devoted. This time would be different. Dad had just finished opening his presents when Claire tapped her champagne glass with a fork. The room quieted. 43 faces turned toward her. She smiled, but I noticed her hand was shaking slightly. She started the way she always did, with a joke about being the favorite daughter. Everyone laughed. She talked about memories from childhood, about Dad teaching her to ride a bike, about the time he drove 4 hours in a snowstorm to see her in a college play. She was charming and nostalgic, and everything our family expected her to be. Then her voice changed. She said there was something she needed to share, something that had been weighing on her for a long time. She said she'd made mistakes, terrible mistakes, and she needed her family to know the truth. She looked directly at our father, and for the first time I saw something like genuine emotion in her eyes. But it wasn't remorse. It was desperation. What happened next unfolded so quickly that I've had to replay it in my mind hundreds of times to understand every detail. Claire didn't confess to stealing from our father. Instead, she told a completely different story. She said that Dad had been giving her money willingly, large sums of money, because he wanted to. She said he'd always favored her, always wanted to make sure she was provided for. But recently, she claimed, he'd been showing signs of confusion, memory problems, early dementia. She'd tried to help him manage his finances because he was no longer capable of doing it himself. She said she was worried about him. She said she'd been researching care facilities in case things got worse. She looked around the room with practiced concern and suggested that maybe it was time for the family to have a difficult conversation about Dad's future. The room went completely silent. I felt like the floor had dropped out from beneath me. I looked at my father, and his face was a mask of confusion and hurt. He didn't have dementia. His memory was sharp. He could tell you the score of every Eagles game from the past 5 years. He could recite poetry he'd learned in elementary school. The only thing confused about him was why his daughter was saying these things in front of his entire family. Before I could speak, before I could defend him, Sophie stood up. My quiet, observant, sensitive little sister stood up with tears streaming down her face and called Claire a liar. Everything after that was chaos. Relatives were shouting over each other. Marcus was trying to get Claire to sit down. Dad was asking what was happening, why Claire would say those things, whether he really was losing his mind. And Claire was crying now too, but they were calculated tears. She was playing the victim, the concerned daughter being attacked for trying to help. I grabbed Daniel's hand and pulled him into the kitchen. My mind was racing. Something was very wrong here. Claire's accusation about Dad's mental state came out of nowhere. It didn't match anything I'd observed. And suddenly, I remembered the bank statement, the withdrawals, the power of attorney, the scattered puzzle pieces that I'd been too distracted to assemble. Daniel saw it in my face. He asked what I was thinking, and I told him I thought Claire had stolen from Dad. I thought she was laying the groundwork to claim he was incompetent so that no one would believe him when he realized the money was gone. Daniel didn't hesitate. He said we needed proof. We needed to move carefully because an accusation like that could tear the family apart even further. But we also needed to protect Dad right now, tonight. I went back into the living room and did something I never thought I'd have to do. I lied to my entire family. I said that Claire was obviously overwhelmed and that we should end the party early so Dad could rest. I smiled and hugged relatives and thanked them for coming while my heart pounded in my chest. I watched Claire watch me, and something in her expression shifted. She knew I suspected something, but she couldn't prove it, and neither could I. After everyone left, I found Dad sitting alone in his bedroom, staring at the family photograph on his nightstand. He looked older than he had that morning, beaten down. He asked me if I thought he was losing his mind. I sat beside him, took his hand, and told him the absolute truth. I told him I believed something was wrong, but not with him. I told him I thought Claire might have done something terrible. I told him I didn't have proof yet, but I was going to find it. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded and said he trusted me. He said he'd always trusted me to tell him the truth, even when it hurt. And he said if I found out that Claire had betrayed him, he wanted to know. He needed to know. Because a man deserved to understand how his own family had treated him. That night, Daniel and I started our investigation. We didn't know it then, but it would take us 7 months to uncover the full scope of Claire's betrayal. 7 months of sleepless nights, of gathering evidence, of building a case that would expose every lie she had ever told. And when we were finally ready, I would stand in front of my sister and watch her world collapse the same way she had tried to collapse ours. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The morning after the birthday party, I called a family lawyer. His name was Robert Chen, and he'd handled my parents' estate planning years ago. I explained the situation as carefully as I could, without making accusations I couldn't yet prove. I told him about the power of attorney, about the bank statement I'd seen, about Claire's strange performance at the party. Robert listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. He said that if Claire had been systematically removing money from our father's accounts, she might have also been planning for the moment when he discovered it. The dementia accusation could be the first step in having him declared incompetent. If she succeeded, she would gain complete control over his remaining assets, and any claim he made against her could be dismissed as the confusion of a mentally declining old man. I asked what we could do. Robert said the first step was to get a comprehensive view of our father's financial situation. We needed bank statements, investment records, credit reports, anything that would show us where the money had gone. Normally, this would require Dad's cooperation, but since Claire had power of attorney, she might have been monitoring his accounts. If she suspected we were looking into her, she could move money, destroy evidence, or accelerate her plans. We needed to be careful. We needed to be patient. And above all, we needed to be smarter than Claire. The next morning, I drove to my father's house. Claire had been texting him constantly since the party, checking in with an intensity that felt more like surveillance than concern. I helped him change the password on his phone so she couldn't monitor his messages. Then I sat him down and asked him to tell me everything about his financial dealings with Claire over the past 7 years. It was painful. Dad trusted Claire completely. He'd given her the power of attorney because she asked for it, and he'd never questioned what she did with it. When she told him she was investing his money, he believed her. When she said the returns were low some quarters, he accepted it. When she needed money for various emergencies, her car, her house, medical bills she claimed Marcus had, he gave it willingly. He had no idea how much he'd given away. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, dispersed over years in amounts carefully designed to avoid detection. Claire had exploited his grief, his loneliness, his desperate need to feel useful to his children after losing his wife. By the time I left his house that day, I was shaking with rage, but I couldn't let the anger control me. Claire was smart. She'd been doing this for 7 years without anyone noticing. If I confronted her now, without proof, she would deny everything. She would double down on the dementia accusation. She might even convince other family members that I was the problem, that I was paranoid or jealous or trying to steal Dad's affection. No, I needed to be strategic. I needed to build an airtight case, and I needed to find allies. The first ally I found was unexpected. Marcus reached out to me 3 days after the party, asking if we could meet for coffee. I almost said no. He was Claire's husband. For all I knew, he was part of her scheme, but something in his voice, a tremor of desperation, made me agree. We met at a cafe on the other side of town, somewhere neither of us would be recognized. Marcus looked terrible. He'd lost weight. There were dark circles under his eyes. He started talking before I even sat down. He told me everything, about Claire's spending, her lies, her manipulation, about how she'd used his identity to open credit accounts, how she'd forged his signature on loan documents, how she'd drained his retirement fund without his knowledge. He said he'd only found out a month ago when a loan officer called about the refinancing. He'd confronted Claire and she'd confessed, but only partially. She'd promised to come clean at the birthday party, to tell the family the truth and ask for forgiveness. Instead, she'd tried to frame their father as mentally incompetent. Marcus said he couldn't live with himself. He'd spent his entire career as a physician, building trust with patients, and now he was married to a woman who'd made him an unwitting accomplice in elder financial abuse. He wanted to make it right. He was willing to testify against Claire, to provide financial records, to do whatever it took to undo the damage she'd caused. I looked at him across the table, trying to judge whether he was genuine or whether this was another layer of Claire's manipulation. His hands were trembling, his eyes were wet with tears he was fighting to hold back. This was a man in crisis, a man whose world had been built on lies and who was only now seeing the truth. I decided to trust him. Over the next few months, Marcus became an invaluable source of information. He had access to financial records that Claire thought were hidden. He knew the passwords to accounts she'd opened in his name. He could tell me about conversations they'd had, about her plans and contingencies, about the web of deception she'd spun over 7 years. The picture that emerged was devastating. Claire had stolen over $460,000 from our father. She'd done it systematically, withdrawing just under the reporting threshold, fabricating investment statements to make him think his money was growing when it was actually disappearing into her accounts. She'd used the money to fund her lifestyle, her house, her cars, her vacations. When that wasn't enough, she'd started using Marcus's identity to take out loans, running up over $100,000 in debt that he knew nothing about. But the most chilling discovery was her contingency plan. Marcus found emails on a laptop Claire thought she'd hidden. In them, she discussed her strategy for dealing with our father if he ever started asking too many questions. She'd researched the process for having an elderly parent declared incompetent. She'd consulted with an attorney about how power of attorney could be upgraded to full conservatorship. She'd even looked into care facilities, not because she was genuinely concerned about Dad's health, but because she wanted to know where she could put him if he became a problem. She was prepared to have our father, a mentally sharp and perfectly healthy 67-year-old man, locked away in a memory care facility to cover up her crimes. When I read those emails, I cried, not from sadness, but from pure, overwhelming rage. This was my sister. This was the woman who'd stood beside me at our mother's funeral, who'd held my hand when I got married, who'd sent me supportive messages when I struggled with infertility. And beneath all of that, she was a predator who saw our father as nothing more than a source of money to be drained and discarded. Daniel held me while I processed the betrayal. He reminded me that we were building something powerful. We were constructing a case that would expose Claire completely, that would protect our father, and that would ensure she faced consequences for what she'd done. Revenge, he said, is a dish best served cold, and we were going to serve it frozen. The next step was documenting everything. Marcus provided bank statements, loan documents, and emails. I obtained records from our father's accounts, comparing his actual balances to the fabricated statements Claire had shown him. Robert, our lawyer, helped us organize the evidence into a coherent narrative. We also consulted with a forensic accountant, someone who specialized in tracking financial fraud. She confirmed that the pattern of withdrawals was consistent with systematic embezzlement and that Claire had clearly been trying to avoid detection. But we needed more than documentation. We needed witnesses. We needed people who could testify to our father's mental competence to counter the dementia narrative Claire was trying to establish. Sophie was the first person I brought into our circle of trust. She'd sensed something was wrong since the birthday party, and when I explained what we'd discovered, she was both horrified and unsurprised. Claire had always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. Sophie had spent her entire life in Claire's shadow, watching her manipulate their parents with charm and calculated vulnerability. The difference now was that Claire's manipulation had crossed a line from emotional to criminal. Sophie agreed to help in any way she could. She started gathering her own evidence, screenshots of social media posts where Claire flaunted expensive purchases, testimonies from relatives who'd witnessed our father's sharp memory and clear thinking, even old videos from family events that showed Dad reciting poetry or recalling obscure historical facts. We were building a wall of evidence that Claire would not be able to climb. Meanwhile, I worked on protecting our father financially. Robert helped us file paperwork to revoke Claire's power of attorney. This was tricky because Claire might notice and accelerate her plans, but it was necessary. We couldn't leave her with legal control over Dad's remaining assets while we built our case. The revocation process took several weeks. During that time, I visited Dad every day, both to keep him company and to monitor for any signs that Claire was moving against him. She called him less frequently after the birthday party. perhaps sensing that her gambit had failed. But she still checked in, still asked probing questions about his health, his finances, his plans. I coached Dad on how to respond without revealing that we were on to her. He played his part perfectly, pretending to be the confused, forgetful old man she was trying to create. The role disgusted him, but he understood its necessity. When the revocation went through, Claire found out immediately. She called Dad in a fury, demanding to know what was happening. He told her that he'd decided to handle his own affairs, that he didn't need her help anymore. She argued, cajoled, threatened, and eventually hung up on him. That night, she called me. The conversation was surreal. Claire's voice was honey-sweet, dripping with concern. She said she was worried about Dad, worried that I was taking advantage of his confusion, worried that I was trying to isolate him from his family. She suggested that maybe I was the one who needed scrutiny, that maybe my interest in Dad's finances wasn't as pure as I claimed. I listened without responding. When she finished, I said only one thing. I said that I knew what she'd done. I knew about the money, the loans, the conservatorship plans, and I said that she should enjoy the next few weeks, because they were the last she'd spend living her lie. Claire laughed. It was a brittle, frightened sound disguised as confidence. She said I was being paranoid, that I'd always been jealous of her, that no one would believe me over her. Then she hung up. I sat in my kitchen for a long time after that call, thinking about the sister I thought I'd known. We'd grown up in the same house, shared the same parents, experienced the same loss. How had she become this person? When had the jealousy and the need for status curdled into something so destructive? Daniel said it didn't matter. Whatever had broken inside Claire wasn't my responsibility to fix. My only responsibility was to protect my father and to ensure that justice was served. The next 2 months were a careful dance. Claire tried to rally family members to her side, painting me as the villain who was isolating their elderly father. Some relatives believed her, at least initially. She was so convincing, so charming, so utterly believable. I let her talk, let her build her narrative, knowing that the evidence we'd gathered would eventually shatter every lie. Meanwhile, Robert was coordinating with law enforcement. Elder financial abuse is a serious crime, and the evidence we'd compiled was more than enough to launch an investigation. The district attorney's office was interested. They assigned a detective to the case, a patient and methodical woman named Detective Angela Morris, who reminded me of Sophie in her quiet intensity. Detective Morris interviewed Marcus extensively. She obtained subpoenas for bank records and phone logs. She built a timeline of Claire's crimes that stretched back 7 years and documented every withdrawal, every fake investment statement, every lie. The case was airtight. The only question was timing. I wanted Claire to be arrested at a moment of maximum impact, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. She was still trying to undermine our father's reputation, still pushing the dementia narrative to anyone who would listen. If she was arrested quietly, she might find a way to spin it, to claim persecution or misunderstanding. But if she was exposed publicly, in front of the people she'd spent years deceiving, there would be no escape. The opportunity came in the form of a family reunion. Every summer, our extended family gathered at my aunt's lake house for a weekend of food, swimming, and reconnection. It was a tradition that stretched back decades, one of the few events that brought together every branch of our sprawling family tree. That year, the reunion fell in late July, 5 months after the birthday party that had started everything. Claire planned to attend. Of course she did. The reunion was a stage, and Claire had always needed an audience. She'd been telling relatives that she was the victim of a family dispute, that I had turned Dad against her, that she was heartbroken and confused by the accusations being leveled against her. The reunion would be her chance to perform her innocence, to win back sympathy, to reclaim her place at the center of our family's attention. She didn't know that Detective Morris would be waiting in the parking lot with an arrest warrant. But before the arrest, there would be one final confrontation. I arranged it carefully. With the detective's approval, and Marcus's cooperation. I wanted Claire to confess in front of witnesses, to remove any doubt about her guilt. The arrest would be the exclamation point, but the confession would be the substance. The reunion started on a Friday afternoon. By Saturday evening, most of the family had arrived. The lake house was crowded with relatives, the air thick with the smell of barbecue and sunscreen. Children ran across the lawn. Adults gathered in clusters, catching up on a year's worth of news. And Claire moved through the crowd like a queen returning from exile, accepting sympathy and offering carefully crafted explanations for the family drama that had unfolded since the birthday party. I waited until after dinner. The sun was setting over the lake, painting the water in shades of orange and gold. Most of the family had gathered on the back porch, drinks in hand, enjoying the view. It was the perfect moment. I stood up and asked for everyone's attention. The conversation died down. Claire was standing near the railing, a glass of white wine in her hand. She looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. I started by thanking everyone for coming. I said that family was important to me, that these reunions were a reminder of everything we shared. Then I said that I had something difficult to discuss, something that had been weighing on me since our father's birthday party. Claire's expression hardened. She knew something was coming, but she didn't know what. I looked directly at her and said that I wanted to give her a chance to tell the truth. I said that I knew what she'd done, that I had evidence, and that things would go better for her if she confessed now, in front of the people she'd deceived. The silence was absolute. 40-something relatives stared at us, uncomprehending. Claire's face went through a rapid series of expressions, first confusion, then anger, then a flash of fear that she quickly masked with indignation. She asked what I was talking about. She said I'd been spreading lies about her for months. She said I was jealous and vindictive and that I'd always resented her success. I didn't argue. Instead, I pulled out my phone and began reading from the evidence we'd compiled. The bank withdrawals, the fake investment statements, the loans taken out in Marcus's name, the emails about conservatorship. I read it all calmly and clearly while Claire's face grew paler and paler. When I finished, I looked at her and asked if she had anything to say. For a moment I thought she might continue to deny it. Her mouth opened and closed. Her eyes darted around the porch, looking for allies, looking for an escape. She found neither. Even the relatives who'd believed her earlier were staring at her with dawning horror. Then Marcus stepped forward. He'd been standing at the edge of the crowd, watching. Now he moved to the center, next to me. He looked at Claire with an expression of profound sadness and told her that it was over. He said he'd given his testimony to the police. He said he'd provided all the documentation. He said there was no way out but the truth. Claire started to cry. Not the calculated tears I'd seen at the birthday party, but real tears, ugly and desperate. She collapsed onto a deck chair and put her head in her hands. And then she started talking. The confession poured out of her like water from a broken dam. She talked about the debts she'd accumulated trying to maintain her lifestyle after her acting career failed. She talked about the shame of coming home a failure, of watching me and Sophie build stable lives while hers crumbled. She talked about how easy it had been to convince Dad to give her power of attorney, how his grief had made him vulnerable, how she'd told herself that she was just borrowing the money and would pay it back someday. She never paid it back. Instead, she took more and more, always telling herself she deserved it, that Dad had more than he needed, that she was the one who'd sacrificed her dreams while Sophie and I had taken the safe paths. The entitlement was breathtaking. Even in her confession, she couldn't quite take responsibility. Everything was someone else's fault. Her failed career, her inadequate husband, her ungrateful family who didn't appreciate all she'd done for them. When she mentioned the conservatorship plan, several relatives gasped. She tried to backtrack, to claim she'd only researched it as a precaution, but the damage was done. Everyone on that porch now understood what she'd been prepared to do. She would have locked our father away, would have stolen his freedom along with his money, would have let him die in a facility believing he was losing his mind. Our father had come to the reunion against my advice, He'd wanted to hear Claire's confession himself. Now he sat in a chair near the door, his face a mask of grief. When Claire finished speaking, he stood up slowly and walked toward her. The porch fell silent. Dad stood over Claire, looking down at the daughter he'd loved and trusted and defended for 67 years. He didn't yell, he didn't cry, he just spoke quietly in a voice that carried across the assembled family. He said he forgave her, not because she deserved forgiveness, but because carrying anger would only hurt him. He said he hoped she would find a way to become the person she'd pretended to be, the daughter he'd believed in, the woman who might have been if she'd made different choices. Then he said he never wanted to see her again. Claire's face crumpled. She reached for him, but he stepped back. He turned and walked into the house, and Sophie followed him, wrapping her arm around his shoulders. I stayed on the porch. There was one more thing to do. I nodded to my cousin, who'd been positioned near the front of the property. He went to get Detective Morris. Claire was arrested in front of 43 family members on the same porch where she'd performed her innocence for hours. The detective read her rights while relatives watched in stunned silence. Marcus stood beside me, his face blank with exhaustion and relief. He'd already filed for divorce. He would spend the next year untangling his finances from Claire's crimes, but he would eventually recover. He was one of her victims, too. The charges against Claire were extensive. Elder financial abuse, identity theft, fraud, forgery. She was denied bail, deemed a flight risk after investigators discovered she'd been researching countries without extradition treaties. The trial was scheduled for the following spring. The months between the arrest and the trial were strange. The family was fractured, but in some ways we were closer than we'd been in years. The relatives who'd believed Claire's lies came to me one by one, apologizing, asking how they could help. Sophie and I took turns staying with Dad, making sure he was never alone. Daniel was my rock, steady and patient through the emotional chaos. Marcus provided testimony that was devastating to Claire's defense. So did the forensic accountant and the detective and several bank employees who'd processed the suspicious transactions. Claire's attorney tried to paint her as a troubled woman who'd made mistakes but didn't deserve prison time. The jury wasn't convinced. In the end, Claire was convicted on all counts. She was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. She would also be required to pay restitution, though everyone knew she had no means to do so. The money was gone, spent on a lifestyle that had been nothing but smoke and mirrors. I was in the courtroom when the verdict was read. Claire didn't look at me. She kept her eyes forward, her face carefully composed, performing dignity, even in defeat. But I saw her hands trembling. I saw the moment when the reality hit her, when she understood that her performance was finally over and the audience had seen through the mask. I didn't feel joy. I'd thought I might after everything she'd done, but watching my sister be led away in handcuffs, I felt only a profound weariness. She had destroyed so much. Our family would never be the same. Dad had recovered most of his financial stability through insurance and legal settlements, but the betrayal had aged him in ways that money couldn't fix. He still flinched when the phone rang, still hesitated before opening his mail, still sometimes woke in the night, wondering if his memory was really failing. Claire's betrayal had stolen something from all of us, not just money, but trust, the ability to believe that the people closest to us would never hurt us. That was gone now, and it would never fully return. But we adapted. We rebuilt. Sophie and I grew closer than we'd ever been, bonded by the crisis we'd navigated together. Dad moved into an apartment near my house where I could check on him daily. Daniel and I eventually did start fertility treatments, and on the 1-year anniversary of Claire's conviction, I found out I was pregnant. A girl. We named her after our mother. I think about Claire sometimes. I imagine her in her prison cell, stripped of the spotlight she'd always craved. I wonder if she's changed, if she's capable of changing, if there's any part of her that truly regrets what she did. I don't know the answer. I'm not sure I want to know. What I do know is that I made a choice. When I discovered my sister's betrayal, I could have looked away. I could have protected the family's image, kept the secret, let Claire continue her performance. Part of me wanted to. Confronting her meant tearing apart everything I'd believed about my family, about the sister I thought I'd known. But some truths demand to be told, some injustices demand to be corrected, and some betrayals are so profound that silence becomes its own crime. I chose truth, I chose justice. I chose to stand beside my father when his own daughter tried to destroy him, and even though the process was painful, even though it cost me a sister I'd loved, I would make the same choice again. That birthday toast was supposed to be a celebration. Instead, it became a confession that split our family forever. But in the wreckage, something new grew, something honest, something strong. My sister tried to steal my father's future. Instead, she lost her own, and I, the middle child, the practical one, the peacemaker who never sought the spotlight, became the one who finally brought the truth to light. There's a certain justice in that, a certain karma. Claire always wanted to be the star of the family drama. In the end, she was. Just not the way she'd imagined. The last time I saw her was at the sentencing hearing. As the bailiff led her away, she turned and looked at me. There was hatred in her eyes, but also something else. Recognition, maybe. Understanding that she had finally met someone who wouldn't be fooled by her performance, who saw through the charm to the emptiness beneath. I held her gaze until the door closed behind her. Then I walked out of the courthouse into the sunshine, where Daniel was waiting with his hand outstretched. Some stories end with reconciliation, some end with forgiveness. This one ends with something different. It ends with the truth, spoken aloud at last. It ends with a family wounded but surviving. It ends with a woman who learned that protecting the people you love sometimes means destroying the lies that threaten them. It ends with me standing in the light, finally free of my sister's shadow. And that, I think, is justice enough.